A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, on a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby and get some thoughts on the week's political agenda ahead. Peter Abetz is the WA State Director for the Australian Christian Lobby. He's joining us today. Hey, Peter, welcome back to 2020.
Good to be with you, Neil, and good to be with your listeners.
Pete, I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the developments around the senator who resigned. Her name is Senator Fatima Payman. But first of all, let's touch on some issues around the sheep export trade, and this particularly affects some listeners who'd be listening in Western Australia, stopping live sheep export trade and the impact on rural communities. What are you thinking?
Look, it's going to have a massive impact on the sheep-producing areas in Western Australia. Basically, what a lot of people don't realise is that the live sheep export trade is actually in older merino sheep, which don't have much of a market here in Australia because as Aussies, we'd much prefer tender lamb than old mutton. And so the reality is that those sheep really can't be fed into the Australian market. Basically, they are an export item. And I think it's fair to say that there were some real issues with the live sheep trade earlier on, but they've really sorted those things out. Like, for example, the death rate was relatively high because some sheep just don't eat the pellets, but now what they've been doing for quite a number of years is they actually put the sheep in pens and they weigh every sheep's numbered, and those that lose weight in the few weeks they're in the holding pens before they get loaded, if they've lost weight, they shunt it back out into a paddock, and only those that have gained weight actually get onto the ships. And interestingly, the death rate now on the ships is actually lower than for the sheep in the paddock, because the older sheep, you always get a certain percentage that die in any given month. So the farmers are pretty upset, as you can well imagine, and it's going to have a massive impact in some of our rural communities where the population's been declining, and with the loss of work for shearers, truck drivers, the stock feed manufacturers, all of that, when that all starts to fall away, that will just exacerbate the drift to the city, and that's not a good thing for our state, I don't think.
Well, Peter, of course, as Christians, we're concerned for the welfare of animals that might be a part of a live export trade. We're also concerned about what happens when there's declining population in rural areas and the effects of stopping a live sheep export trade on what might happen in communities. So what you're saying here is that communities need to be bracing themselves because major changes may be ahead.
Very much so, and the government has announced a funding package to help the communities transition, and as the communities, I think, rightfully say, the communities will simply shrink because there is no other employment there other than farming, and if you move to a form of farming that requires less labour, inevitably people will drift out of those rural communities.
So you've got people affected. I think you mentioned shearers and truck drivers. There's a lot of infrastructure that goes around the thought of even exporting a live sheep. There's a lot of involvement there from community. There's a lot of necessity for communities to be flourishing, for those things to work. And if you take those things out, then communities may well just shrink down to nothing. As you say, there's something likely to be a transition from sheep farming to more cropping. And that's got its own challenges too, hasn't it?
It does, and again, the fact that the sheep industry will shrink because basically because the export sheep are primarily merino, which are not favoured for meat in Australia, but in the Middle East they quite like that type of sheep meat, and I think over time as those Middle Eastern countries develop further, and as refrigeration and freezing becomes more common, the move to actually slaughter sheep here in Australia and export them as carcass meat will continue to grow, but to simply shut it down is going to have quite a devastating impact.
Oh, we'll look forward to hearing any updates from you as you're concerned about those rural communities there in Western Australia. Hey, let's talk about a very big development that's happened over these past few days. Senator Fatima Payman resigned from the Labor government and will sit as an independent on the crossbench. There's lots of implications for what she's done here. What are your immediate thoughts?
Look, I think there's a number of issues that emerge from it. One is that, Senator Payman is quite a young senator. I think he's 28 or 29 years of age, and so doesn't have a lot of experience of navigating complex political issues, I guess, in the party room and so on. So, I think it's been a very challenging time for her, and the pressure that she's felt to sort of side with those that are sort of pro-Palestinian voices in the current war situation in Gaza. That must have been enormous pressure on her. But I think her resignation actually raises a whole lot of questions for a lot of people, because there's been speculation as to whether she would become part of the Muslim votes kind of movement. And for those the listeners who may not be aware of it, but there is a website, Muslim Votes, where they're basically saying that the Muslim community has sufficient numbers in certain federal seats where if Muslims voted as a bloc, they could actually have a major impact on the election results for the federal government. They could actually topple seats. Like here in Western Australia, for example, the seat of Burt has a very significant Muslim population, and apparently traditionally they tend to vote Labor, but if they were to vote differently, that could certainly bring about a change in the representation for that seat. So that's but Senator Payman has indicated that she doesn't want to go down that path. She wants to represent all of her community, all the state, and so she's indicated that she won't be going down that path. But it's still very early days, I think, for her. She's still finding her way in this whole new field.
Okay, the reason why she resigned from the Labor Party, and, she's done that of her own volition. As I understand it, she wasn't pushed, but obviously if you don't toe the line, you're going against the grain for what happens in the Labor Party. And so she's felt as though the Albanese government has not been as forthright and in support of the Palestinian people and the issues around the war in Gaza. I mean, this is creating quite a significant challenge here now for the Labor government, because there might be all sorts of ramifications from this, and not least of those, as you say, something along the lines of the Muslim votes movement, which could well be the foundations for an Islamic political party in Australia. Is that a possibility, do you think?
Well, I think there is a possibility. Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese spoke about the fact that they consider religious political parties, or the emergence of religious political parties, as divisive. But I think what they need to realise is that major political parties, they need to actually make room or allow room for people of faith. And I think if you look historically at Australia, say if you go back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, even 50s, whether you were Labor or Liberal, basically you shared the Judeo-Christian values. That was just a given in Australian society. But what's tended to happen is that, for example, the Labor Party, from what I can see, the people who have a biblical Christian worldview find it increasingly difficult to actually get traction in that party because their views on, say, gender and sexuality are simply not accepted in that sort of setting. In the Liberal Party, you have, say, here in Western Australia, we have a section of the Liberal Party that very disparagingly refers to the Christian people in the Liberal Party as the churchies, and they don't speak of them in a positive light, which again makes some Christians in the Liberal Party feel, well, hang on, don't they want us to be part of the party? And so that helps a party like Australian Christians, which has been going for many years in Western Australia, to gain traction, because people will join that party because it's a party that shares their view of the world. And given the change in the West Australian state voting laws, now that the whole upper house, the whole state is the electorate instead of the six regions, and it used to be six regions and each region elected six people. Now the whole state is the electorate, like in New South Wales. So you only need about 2.68% of the primary vote, and you've got a quota and you can get somebody in. So somebody like Australian Christians have a real opportunity to get someone in, and there's a real possibility that, say, if the Muslim community were to form a political party, that they could get someone in as well at the state level. At the Senate level, it'd be more difficult, but nonetheless, it's interesting days, that's for sure.
It is, and no doubt there'll be some listeners who'd be very interested in your reflections there, and reflecting on what pardon me, on what more is specific to WA, but where you've got people within the Liberal Party in Western Australia referring to the Christians as the churchies. That's something that's probably likely to catch on, isn't it? Because, the churchies, and when you say that it's usually delivered in a disparagingly way, then there's a certain sense in which, there might be a rebellion against the Liberal and National parties around the nation. So, I mean, as you're saying, that seems to have fueled some of the support for Australian Christians in WA. So it's an interesting way that the dynamic works there, Peter. Any thoughts from you there on the dynamic?
Yeah, look, I think the reality is that what's happened is, as the Labor parties tended to become less sympathetic to a Christian worldview, there have been a significant number of what I refer to as the old Labor kind of people actually shifting across to the Liberal Party, but some of those have actually then gone on to join Australian Christians because they feel more comfortable in that kind of setting. But the reality is that in our voting system, because for the lower house you need to get 50% plus one, minor parties have great difficulty in ever winning a seat. So it's really for the upper house or the Senate where those minor parties can have a significant impact. So it'll be interesting to see what happens at the next state election here in WA as regards to minor parties. But coming back to Senator Payman's situation, if she were to run as an independent at the next time she comes up for re-election, the whole Muslim community in Western Australia could be voting for, plus others who share her views on the Palestine, Gaza kind of situation. She may have a chance of getting re-elected.
Let's stay with Senator Payman for a moment and your reflections on our national leaders, because it seems to be that both Peter Dutton, as the opposition leader, and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, they've both been reflecting on thoughts around church and state, or religiousness and state, and this has really brought this very much to the fore, hasn't it? But it's both sides that are playing down the sort of church and state issues here.
Well, I think it's actually the church and state issue is, in a way, it's almost a furphy, because the reality is that every member of parliament has a worldview. A person who's an atheist has a worldview that shapes their way of thinking. A Muslim has a certain worldview. A Christian has a certain worldview. And basically it's the questions, where did we come from, who am I, what's the purpose of life, how I determine what's right and what's wrong, and what happens when I die. Those 5 questions are really the essence of a person's worldview, and even the atheist has to answer those questions, and in their answering of those questions, that determines how they operate. So to kind of, in a sense, everybody is religious, or if you want to use a different terminology, everyone has a worldview, and political parties need to be broad enough, I believe, the major parties need to be broad enough to create room for people who have a Christian worldview to be able to feel that they are respected, not necessarily always get their way, but that their views are valued and taken seriously. And when that's not happening, that then will fuel the desire for minor parties, for people to join minor parties, such as Australian Christians, or if the Muslim community forms a Muslim party.
Stay with Senator Payman here for a moment, because she's a West Australian senator, and you're based in Western Australia, and you've been able to, no doubt, observe, maybe even interact with her at different times over recent years. How does she present herself when she's saying things that used to be on behalf of the Labor Party, and how will those things be reflected now that you think that she's as a independent?
Well, I mean, Senator Payman is actually a very pleasant person. Like, when you meet her, she's very friendly, a very pleasant person to be around. No question about that at all. But she's been quite outspoken. Like, for example, I'm a councillor of the City of Gosnells, and when we have our citizenship ceremonies, we sometimes invite federal members of Parliament to come along and to say a word or two of congratulations. And the rules are that you're not allowed to say anything political in those speeches, because it's totally non-partisan. It's about becoming a citizen and all that. And she has raised eyebrows a couple of times in what she said. It's Aboriginal land, always will be, and etc., which is a very political statement. So she's got a little bit of a track record of being very outspoken and not quite sticking to the rules. And I guess that's partly what's made it difficult for her, is that from the media reports at least, she apparently never even raised the issue about Palestine in the party room, and so that wasn't really debated in the party room apparently. So one just wonders to what extent she actually was, why she didn't use the machinery within the Labor Party to try and get oxygen to her views and to try and get more people on side.
Okay, well, no doubt there's something to monitor along there as things develop, because there might be all sorts of questions that might come to the fore that may be premature to talk about now. But what about other MPs in either our federal parliaments or in states that might have alignments as Muslims, and what they might need to do, and what sort of pressure they might be under if there is a Islamic political movement that is really birthed and begins to get momentum here in Australia. Always great getting your insights, and let me point listeners to the website for the Australian Christian Lobby and to follow some of the views of Peter Abetz. Peter is the West Australian State Director for the Australian Christian Lobby, acl.org.au. acl.org.au. And Peter, thanks so much for sharing these thoughts with us today on 2020.
Good to be with you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.